Morning, Chris. How you doing?
Hi, Ron. Doing great. Looking forward to diving in today. This is going to be a really interesting one that I think will be very powerful for a lot of folks. We're going to be talking today about HIPAA with WordPress and using a headless HIPAA platform for WordPress. And Ron, I think this is really, really powerful. We also, time permitting, and this may be in a separate video, can also talk about WooCommerce and tokenizing the PHI within WooCommerce as well as a separate topic. But anyway, I'm excited to dive in and looking forward to sharing this info with folks.
Yeah, same. This is something that we've just started getting into probably in the last 2 years. I mean, I think most of you've seen a lot of our videos or listened to a lot of the podcasts. And, we've done about 1,500 sites. And out of the 1,500, probably about 250 or 300 are medical. So although we do a lot of e-commerce, we do a lot of marketplace, we do a lot of other things, our single largest vertical is medical. So we love HIPAA. We do a lot of it. Typically, we design and build and use other CMSs or our own platform when designing and building these HIPAA sites. But recently, we've had a lot of clients, especially after COVID, right, trying to figure out how to take their existing WordPress sites and make them HIPAA compliant. Now, we've talked in previous videos, but we'll just review it here for 10 seconds. We've talked about the 3 tiers of HIPAA and how clarity from a development perspective, when we talk about the 3 tiers, it's, good, better, best, inexpensive, mediocre, inexpensive, right? I mean, that's kind of how it is. Amount of effort, little, medium, and a lot, right? I mean, that's just kind of how the breakdown is. So if we break it into those 3 tiers and help our clients when we're talking about their projects understand that, it helps us very rapidly figure out, is this a $10,000, a $30,000, a $100,000 project, right? And it's very easy to understand the difference between one of them. One is a partial HIPAA. So you're fully maintaining and you are HIPAA compliant, but the site itself is only partially HIPAA compliant. We'll talk about that first. The second one would be the site can be fully HIPAA compliant, but we're only storing PHI, right? So maybe like an online pharmacy where we take prescriptions, they upload their prescriptions, they buy the drugs and off they go, but nobody can go in and edit that, where tier 3 is editable. So Ron goes in, meets with a doctor diagnoses him with type 2 diabetes, then comes back and later on diagnoses him as type 1, but then he can't get life insurance. So he goes back and changes it to type 2. You have to track all that if you allow editing. And that's tier 3. And so there's a lot more compliance that has to happen with tier 3 than with the other 2. So we always like to talk about the level of HIPAA compliance you have to have, because we might be able to make you fully HIPAA compliant by doing tier 1 HIPAA compliance. And that's kind of what you were talking about a minute ago with the headless, right? So let's go ahead and talk about, and if you want, I can start with talking about Brian's site that we did a couple of years ago. And that was kind of the first foray, that I did into that one. But I can either talk about that, or if you want, you can kind of talk about the tier 1 and what that means, and how it's kind of, I call it HIPAA through obfuscation, right? It's a workaround.
Go for it. Let's dive in.
Which allows us to be fully HIPAA compliant, right?
That's right. Yeah, I say go for it. Let's dive in.
Okay. So we have a client, really good client of ours we've been working with for years. And he was one of the owners and founders of Shining Star Therapy. And Shining Star Therapy, when they first came to us, they were hiring therapists of all kinds in the Chicago area. And basically, he wanted us to build a portal to help recruit all of their therapists. And so we designed, it was just a marketing portal. So it was a nice WordPress site. I did all the graphics originally, did all the SEO, local SEO. Anyway, it blew up his business. I mean, really worked well. Over the course of, the previous 2 years, he hadn't been able to hire 4 people. And within the first 6 months of launching the site, we'd hired over 20, and it was close to 40 people by the end of year 1. I mean, we did really well together. So well that families and such started finding the website themselves through the SEO efforts that we were doing, and they were wanting to register. So Brian came back later and wanted to have some HIPAA onboarding forms and be able to do the HIPAA consent forms for treating children, things like that. But didn't want to go back and do a full HIPAA compliant, which meant we had to go back and do a complete new HIPAA hosting, new HIPAA website, and then migrate the old site to the new website. It was a fairly large endeavor. So back in the day when we did that, this is probably about 8 years ago, there was no jot forms, right? Many of you know what jot forms is now, but there was no jot forms. And so we basically did the equivalent of a jot forms for Brian. What we did was, to work around the HIPAA, we had to understand the tiers of HIPAA and what we were doing with the PHI data. Basically, all we were doing is, on an intake form, since there's an SSL certificate on the website, all of the data on the screen is encrypted, right? And if we hit the button to submit the form, the data in transit is encrypted. It was, where is the data going to go and where is the data going to be stored that would force us to violate HIPAA, right? On his non-HIPAA compliant, non-encrypted WordPress website. So what we ended up doing for him at the time was we basically built our own version of jot forms, right? He went to Google and got a HIPAA compliant email box. And then when we installed the Gravity Forms plugin to build the form on the website for the intake forms, when you hit the button to submit the form, it normally stores the form data on the WordPress site in that non-encrypted, non-compliant database as well. So we literally just went in and modified the form posting action to do nothing but the notification. And that notification in this case was only sent to that HIPAA compliant mailbox. So basically what we did was we posted with an SSL certificate, HIPAA compliant form on the screen. And then when they hit the post button, it sent the results straight to a HIPAA compliant mailbox. And then his staff would get the notification that there was a new mail. They would go in and they would have all the information there. And then if they wanted to manually transfer that into an EMR or whatever, they could. But this was a less than $1,000 option versus a $10,000 to $15,000 option. And even more so, if he wanted to do the integration with the EMR directly, would have been another $20,000, $25,000. So we had a $1,000 option, tier one, and now he had a HIPAA compliant intake and consent giving process, all because we sat down, talked through the tiers of HIPAA, knew exactly what we were doing with the PHI data, and found a way to work around and maintain the HIPAA compliance with regards to the PHI without having to make the website itself fully HIPAA compliant. So that's kind of what we talk about tier one, and that would be potentially embedding components of the PHI handling that are HIPAA compliant, but exposing them and marrying them with a non-compliant website so we don't have to do as much either HIPAA hosting costs or HIPAA development or migrating an entire website from being non-HIPAA to a HIPAA compliant site. Let me let you expound on that, Chris, and talk any more about that if you'd like.
Absolutely. I think the bottom line here is there are options that you have available to you from a business perspective to be able to comply with HIPAA and generally provide the privacy and the security compliance that are part of HIPAA to your end customers without necessarily having to take on the full cost and maintenance and timeline impact of having a complete system for yourself directly. And I think that is so powerful for most businesses. Most businesses want to function their business, not become the world's experts at HIPAA. And fundamentally, right, whenever you go to some of these more extreme tiers, you, respective to your business, end up having some level of expertise throughout your organization around HIPAA that may not actually be necessary to operate the business if you didn't have that software in the first place and you weren't using that software. And it's something that, if possible for you to not have to invest in, it makes sense at a certain phase of the business. Of course, as you continue to grow and develop, you're going to want to take advantage of these principles of obfuscation, tokenization, de-identification, and basically putting things into silos to isolate the risk. That's a really powerful concept in general. And nonetheless, as you go to these higher phases of control, you will probably also want to be able to directly control this process and the data, and not have it live in a third party. So that's really where we get into some of these other aspects and approaches that still take advantage of de-identification and tokenization, right, Ron?
Yeah. Exactly. So moving on to kind of the next level of that before we get into the full HIPAA, right, would probably be something like the Clarity Tokenization Vault, right? And so basically what we did was we kind of took the example, just kind of for the sake of this description here, we kind of did what we did for Brian, but we can do it for anything now. So basically, for example, let's say a client has HubSpot. I've got 3 clients right now that have HubSpot that want to integrate HubSpot with their EMRs, their EHRs, so they can do some communication and marketing and some automated marketing that HubSpot does really well. But that violates HIPAA if they start pulling that PHI data into HubSpot when HubSpot is not and cannot be HIPAA compliant, right? So what do? Well, you'd mentioned a couple things there with the tokenization and de-identification, right? Those are 2 different models that would allow us to actually do that. And so what the Clarity Vault is, it's kind of like I put my money in Chase Bank. I log in on my phone and I see on the screen, I've got whatever that, pick your number, $100 in checking account, right? I can see that money. It's right there, but it's really not there, right? There is no cash sitting in my phone. There is no cash sitting in an account. That's just a ledger entry. The cash, the money, the gold, whatever is actually sitting back in a vault somewhere, right? They don't leave it out on the phone. They might have some money in the teller's drawers when I actually go to the bank, but I physically have to go to the bank to get the cash, or I have to go to an ATM to get the cash, right? It's not sitting on my phone where I'm looking on the screen. So if you think about it that way, that's exactly the same thing that holds true for HubSpot. The data isn't necessarily sitting in HubSpot when I'm looking at data on the screen, right? That data could be a reference to the data, the PHI data sitting back in a vault, just like at the bank. I'm looking at a balance on the screen, but the cash is physically sitting in a vault somewhere. That is exactly what tokenization is, or de-identification is, with regards to HIPAA. Clarity offers a HIPAA vault service that we can use with any application, any database, any web app, any mobile app, anything, where if PHI data cannot be physically stored in that application or in HubSpot, we can store it in the vault. And then just like giving a balance to that account that's in the vault, the cash that's sitting in the vault, we give either a de-identified piece of information to that, a link to that information, if you will, or we can provide a token, which is the same as a link to that. So Chris, why don't you dive in a little more on the technical application of the vault? I know I've given just a high level explanation. I'm sure it's not really good.
It was great. It's great. And I think the biggest thing that we want to do in this conversation is really leverage your approach to the discussion married to mine so that folks get some of the technical, but all of the business side, ideally. And I think it's perfect. And what I would say to this is, if you sort of think about the physical workflow of what's happening, some key points with de-identification and tokenization to make sure that it actually is functional. If you go and take a look at the HHS.gov website and look at the rules around de-identification, it's really specific. And there's a strong implication in the rules from the HHS website where the HIPAA rules are posted for public consumption. It basically says it's really hard to actually de-identify properly. Like, you basically need to hire an expert to actually do that properly. And I think the main point that they're making is that it can be pretty easy to pair up data again and re-identify it if you don't de-identify it properly. And sort of the foundational thought here is you don't want to leave traces or remnants that would allow someone with access to be able to remarry the PHI back to this other just contact information and information that would identify somebody. So anyway, long story short, one of the key aspects of this would be, for example, whenever your data is getting tokenized, you don't want it to go to any of your persistent data stores. You don't want it to actually save anywhere. You want it to go straight from a form or an intake process directly to be tokenized. So it never persists anywhere in your system. And that can be something on the technical front, Ron, that I think a lot of people may or may not be aware of. That's like a physical issue. If there's a logging tool that's in place that's pushing data and persisting it that you are expecting to have tokenized, but it's actually saving it to a non-secure system, that could put you at risk and basically just have less of a security, sort of hardening than you were expecting. So that's an interesting aspect of tokenization and de-identification, is just actually getting into the weeds and seeing when does the information that was PHI get tokenized? When does it get de-identified? Is it getting persisted somewhere where it could then be, if there was a security breach, it could be accessed and re-identified. So I think that's a really sort of key fundamental for folks to think about. The other thing in general is, what is the actual process of data going across the wire? Is it encrypted? Do you have a connection to the tokenization platform that you're testing and making sure that there hasn't been some what's typically referred to as a man-in-the-middle attack, where if your site that is a public site that is exposed to attack, if it were to be attacked and someone changed your site, but they did it in a stealth way where they got into the CMS system, they changed the forms to point to forms that they made that look exactly like your forms, and you just don't know it. And they're taking all of that PHI information, and maybe they're sending it to your typical system, but they're in the middle. So you don't know they're there because they're not announcing it. They're just stealing all this information in stealth mode because they were able to attack. So these are sort of things that you want to be thinking about whenever you're executing on these type of projects, is how are you going to prevent this HIPAA data from, getting stored somewhere where you're expecting it to not be, or have someone have access to be able to get at it and impersonate that they should have access, and that they're basically man in the middle taking over that transaction and then sending it along still. So you're none the wiser that they're sitting there in the middle, intercepting the data and taking it as well. And those are just a few examples that are somewhat technical, but hopefully you can understand that the concept here is that fundamentally you have this opportunity when you're working with these embedded forms and headless systems to think about the different edge cases and ask the questions: what are the security risks and how are we addressing each of those? What is the specific bullet list of security risk, resolution, validation that the resolution is in place? How are we auditing for this and making sure we're not getting attacked in this way? And that's really what HIPAA is all about. It's about ongoing, proactive, consistent best practices within your industry and your space based on the sensitivity of the data.
Yeah, that's a good point. The two things there where you really, and Chris had mentioned this earlier in today's recording, he talked about making sure you talk to someone who is an expert. So basically, we've given you a couple examples about tier one and how we can work around HIPAA. The problem with that I've seen is a significant number of my clients that come to me and talk about that, they've tried to do it on their own. They're like, oh, okay, I understand the concept, so I'm going to do what you did. But unfortunately, then what they do is they've got, and I'm not even going to mention any hosting providers because I'll accidentally defame somebody, and I don't mean to do that. So some cheap hosting provider that they're paying $14.95 a month for with a free WordPress site. And then they're like, oh, I'll just do what Ron said. And so then they turn around and implement something. And then, you hear about those guys that stick on that thing in the credit card at the gas pumps, right? It's on front of the other one. So when you stick your credit card in, the gas pump still works. So you're still pumping gas. And so the gas station got your number, but their little scan device also stole your number to use it. And that's what Chris is talking about. It doesn't necessarily negatively impact your business, nor do you even know they're there. But the problem is if you don't secure that front end and protect that form, then if they hack that form, no matter how HIPAA compliant your process is, no matter how you're treating the PHI data, if you've allowed them to steal a stream or a copy of that PHI data, you've failed. And so not only is it the form and the intake and the area where that is that has to be secured, even if it's not fully HIPAA compliant, the in between, the middleman that Chris was just talking about, has to be HIPAA compliant, right? We have our integration platform called Connect. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. Just want to take a quick break and remind you, we've got some free technical resources for you linked down in the description. Thanks for watching again. Let's get back to the video. Connect has a Redis queue. Now, what does that all mean technically? Well, the great thing we do is when we integrate these portals to the client's backend CRMs and ERPs, if the CRM or ERP is offline, if it crashed, if it's being rebooted, if it's got down for just particular maintenance, whatever. Well, take the example of a $100,000 order came in online and we tried to move it for fulfillment into the ERP and the ERP is being rebooted. You don't want to lose that $100,000 order. Well, pretend that $100,000 order is PHI information. So now all of a sudden we have this very expensive PHI information coming in. It hits our Connect server. Our Connect server goes to transfer it and put it into the ERP that is offline. So what does it do? It queues it and stores it locally so that it can retry the connection. So later on, it can then push it into the ERP. Well, guess what? When it stores it offline, we have just now stored PHI data. Is that middleman also HIPAA compliant? And are we just violating HIPAA now because we were forced to temporarily store data as it was in transit, where it was encrypted in transit, but now we had to store it in a queue while we're waiting for the ERP to be rebooted and come back online? We just violated HIPAA. So talking to an expert can help ensure that not only are you protecting the PHI in where the whole 3/4 of this conversation was in these vaults, in these compliant manner, but that securing it in the front end and the intake of the PHI has been secured, and then the transferring of the PHI has been secured. So I don't have anything else, Chris. I think that kind of covers today really about, tier 1 and tier 2. We can get into another one where we talk about tier 3 and we get into the user editing and tracking and the log files and all that for, online pharmacies and doctor-patient portals. But I think for today, we covered most what I wanted to cover. Was there anything else you wanted to close off?
No, I think that was great. And for folks listening, thank you guys for tuning in. We encourage you to take advantage of the free resources that we've made available. You can access some of those in the description and many more on our website, where we have literally complimentary masterclasses on HIPAA, on being able to comply with HIPAA, mistakes that people commonly make and how to prevent those, etc. So we'll look forward to seeing you potentially in those. And thanks again for watching, folks. Ron, I look forward to the next one. Bye for now, everyone.
Thanks, Chris. Bye for now.